Thank you so much for joining us. We are in partnership with Northern California grantmakers and Southern California grantmakers to bring you weekly updates on everything that you need to know about the COVID-19 response from philanthropy. And today we're joined by some wonderful speakers. And we're actually going to kick it off with just a momentary deep breath. I think if you're like me, when I said that, I actually noticed that I relaxed my shoulders, a little bit of tension in the back. So wherever you are, I would just invite you to join me in a breath in, maybe some motion, and a breath out. Oh, and let's all, be, oh, good. I have a captive audience. Let's all just be here for the next hour, be together, really focused on the reason that we've come here today. So with that, I seem to have lost it. I want to let you know what we're in for today, and then I'm going to hand it directly over to you. Yep, totally lost. Oh, you just get faces. We're going to start by hearing from Nancy Sasaki, who's the CEO of the United Way of San Diego, providing an update on the Workers Assistance Initiative, which is distributing funds where I am here in San Diego. We've got a commitment to sharing some of that information out with our community, so she'll speak for a couple of minutes, and then I'll hand it over to Debbie McKeon, who's the president and CEO of San Diego Grantmakers, on behalf of Philanthropy California, to introduce the context, and then we will go from here, and you'll hear really exciting and important information from everybody whose face you're looking at now. So with that, Nancy, I would be happy to have you share with us, and just reminding our folks in the audience, you have that chat box and that Q&A at the bottom of your screen. Please don't hesitate to use it, and we will get started. Nancy, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Megan, and thank you to San Diego Grantmakers, Philanthropy California, for inviting me to participate and tell you a little bit about the fund that we've developed and how that is all going. It seems like ages ago, but it really wasn't all that long ago, on the 16th of March, that we announced our partnership along with Supervisor Nathan Fletcher, San Diego Gas and Electric, San Diego Foundation, and the San Diego and Imperial County Labor Council, along with United Way, was launching a fund that was the COVID-19 Response Fund. That fund actually sits at the San Diego Foundation, and a part of that what kicked that off was money from SDG&E that they put $1 million into the fund, of which they designated $250,000 to United Way for our Worker Assistance Initiative. So the Worker Assistance Initiative is separate from the COVID Response Fund housed at the foundation. Since that time, the foundation has been incredibly successful in raising funds for their COVID Response Fund. It's over, I believe, over $6 million at this point, and probably potentially even over that. But as I said, only $250,000 was designated to the Worker Assistance Initiative. We have also been doing our own fundraising to build that initiative, but not at the same success rate as the foundation. Our fund, even in partnership, was to initially provide funds for rent and mortgage, utility bills, food, and income gap recovery. Since March the 16th, a lot has been coming in, a lot has been changing, and as a result of that, it's really caused us to want to stop and make sure that where we distribute our funds are going to the people that are going to be most in need. We have, I just am getting the information, as of 11 o'clock yesterday, we had, well, actually, as of this afternoon, we have 7,421 applications in the door. Yesterday, as of 11 o'clock, out of 6,400 applications, $8 million was requests for rent and mortgage. 481,000 are for utilities other than gas and electric, and about 823,000 is for gas and electric bills. The gas and electric bills are funded by a program by SDG&E that we had been running prior to this crisis. We call it the Neighbor to Neighbor Fund. In that fund, there were certain stipulations that allowed somebody to be eligible to be helped through that fund that we are right now in the process of clearing up so that we can be more efficient and more flexible on who we actually fund to pay their gas and electric bills. The SDG&E, as I said, has been an incredible partner. That fund, when we started all of this crisis work, had about $357,000 in it. SDG&E has committed to building that fund to $1 million. So we're very excited about that and being able to, but like I said, right now we have about $823,000 in requests that are in the door right now for just gas and electric. What we've noticed, as you know, there's a whole lot of back-end stuff that we've been having to do and just building the system, and that has been a part of the delay in being able to get money out the door. The other is working out some of the procedural issues, as I mentioned. And the other is the Federal CARES Act that is going to cause us to rethink who is in need now, since many of the workers that are in need right now will be eligible for unemployment, since they expanded it to include gig workers as well as self-employed. They will be getting their uninsurance plus the $600 bonus. There will be some that get the stimulus check as well, but we know that money won't go very far. So we're still trying to listen to the community and figure out who's going to fall between the cracks. We know there are going to be people that are disabled. There will be people in the refugee community. There will be people who have lived their lives on a cash-only basis. There are also people in the community that should have been paying taxes and weren't paying taxes, and they are basing this on your tax returns. So there may be some people that fall through there as well. So we are actually, as I speak right now, doing the final screener training for our staff. We will begin processing applications this afternoon, and we expect to be getting money out the door by tomorrow or Monday at the latest. Again, we only have so much money for us to work with, and we continue to fundraise to build that fund so that we can really help people that are in need. We also have a food distribution site as a part of the food bank, and we are continuing to distribute food as well. And the Labor Council, and with money that was also given through SDG&E and the food bank, with money that they've also been given, are helping to support us in being able to distribute food as well. Nancy, so that's the status of our Worker Assistance Initiative and kind of where we're at right now.
Thank you so much. And I think that just really illustrates how important it is that we all have these folks here to share with us how to access the federal funds. Nancy, I know you're busy, so if you need to, please feel free to do so. You can stay with us for the rest of the time.
I didn't know if there were any questions that I could answer now, maybe.
I think Megan is having a buffering problem at this time. Yeah.
See, the only question. Yep. So the only question, Nancy, was about the geographic area for which the fund covers, which is San Diego County. And I also shared a link into the Q&A box for a website that lists funds throughout California. So wherever you are, you can go there to find that.
Perfect. Thank you so much, and thank you for having me on the call.
Appreciate it. Take care. Okay, Debbie.
You too.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Nancy. We appreciate that. And thank you, Megan. You know, I think it's really important to ground ourselves in the why we do the work. And I think Nancy gave us a briefing from the field on the ground that she and all of her colleagues across the United Ways across the state are finding and seeing. So I think it just helps us really put in context the learning that we're going to take away today and how we can put that into action. So I'd just like to express thanks from Philanthropy California that I'm here to be able to represent as the CEO of San Diego Grantmakers. We're an alliance of over 600 funders strong. And really, it's with the direction and the support of our members that we're able to be leaders for the state policies and the support that the nonprofit sectors were able to achieve through the federal resources and state resources that we're going to talk about today. So it's also, I think, really important to give a great shout out to the public policy committees and the boards of directors of North California grant makers, Southern California grant makers, and San Diego grant makers, because it's really because of their leadership and their tremendous vision to lean into this work, to advocate both individually as well as collectively for us to be able to support the nonprofit sector. So just as I think about what we're going to talk about today, I really see this as a learning opportunity for all of us. You know, we're learning about the resources that the nonprofit sector may access, but I'm also mindful that this is the best information that we have today. I think you'll hear from several speakers that it's a very dynamic and changing environment, and that it's also very uncertain times. So it's really difficult, not only for the nonprofit sector, but for all of us who are trying to help assure that they have the support they need. So as challenges continue to mount every day, I think we're constantly looking for ways in which we can maximize the benefits to them. So all across California, those of us at Philanthropy California are seeing that our members are transitioning their existing grants to general operating support. They're removing reporting requirements, providing new expedited grant support, and they're leveraging their social and their political expertise to get additional funding and support, and also raising our collective voices to advocate and educate on behalf of the nonprofit sector. This is hugely important. So I hope as you hear about the opportunities that are available today, that as you think about it, it will give you a bias towards action. As you think about the nonprofit sector and ways that you could engage to either provide new or continued support, especially as they're seeking to access the programmatic and the small business government funding that's really critical for them at this time. So I'm pleased to help guide us through this conversation to turn to Sid Barakara to help frame up and make some opening remarks. I just want to mention that Sid brings a really special lens to this conversation. Today, he's Senior Vice President at Strategies 360, but in his past, he has both deep government and philanthropic experience, having been the Deputy Director of External Affairs at the California Governor's Office of Business and Economic Development in the Brown administration, and Program Manager at the California Endowment. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Sid. Thanks so much for starting us off.
Thank you very much, Debbie, and thanks to Philanthropy California for hosting today's webinar. Good afternoon and namaste to all of you. Like me, I am sure you are receiving a steady stream of information with resources and invites to webinars to learn what tools are available to support you or your grantees bridge this crisis. I certainly hope today's conversation leaves you with the information for you to take action or provide some context to information you've been seeing in the news or in your inbox. I thought I would kick off today's discussion with a few takeaways from a March 18th survey of nonprofit leaders conducted by the USD School of Leadership and Education Sciences. I thought this would help ground us in what our nonprofits are facing and provide a pretext to the information our panelists will provide momentarily. To be clear, researchers only contacted nonprofit leaders in San Diego County, but I'm sure these statistics mirror your own experiences or nonprofits in your community, wherever you may be today. The majority of nonprofit respondents said they have had to reduce or cease to operate programs. More than 3/4, 80% of respondents reported a reduction of normal services, and 20% of respondents reported they were unable to offer any programs. Just over half of leaders reported they were very likely to make payroll in the 4 weeks at the time the survey was taken, and that percentage declined to 35%, 8 weeks from 18th when that survey was conducted. I actually recognize how grim that sounds when we consider that many of our nonprofit organizations are on the front line of this pandemic. And here's what those leaders said are their top needs: reevaluating fundraising strategies, sharing real-time data about our nonprofit needs with funders, government officials, and corporate leaders, financial scenario planning, and coaching sessions for leading in ambiguity. There are other takeaways, and in the chat box, we're going to provide you with that survey so you can review it in its entirety. And new fundings are coming online, as we've heard, from the recently signed federal law known by its acronym, the CARES Act. And 2 weeks ago, the legislature sent Governor Newsom Senate Bill 89, a $1 billion supplemental disaster package. That legislation gives the governor broad discretion over how to spend it. Now, moreover, over 30 legislators led by Assemblywoman Rivas have sent Governor Newsom a letter requesting specific steps to support the ongoing operations of our nonprofit community. That letter mirrored one authored by Cal Nonprofits to the governor and state leadership. We've put that letter in the chat box for your review as well. Finally, a review of the CARES Act by the independent sector is also in the chat box. The CARES Act includes new rules and tools from charitable giving to emergency loan packages such as the Paycheck Protection Program, which you're going to hear about from Claire, and emergency economic injury grants. It also provides resources for nonprofit employment and employee retention credit. Again, these are two things we heard directly from our survey respondents. In the interest of time, we're also adding additional funding allocations based on the independent sector's analysis to this chat box for your review. Governor Newsom's mantra during this crisis is that California is and must meet this moment. All of you are critical to meet this moment, to care for our most vulnerable populations, and to ensure our economy is able to recover as quickly as possible. With that, I would like to now turn it over to Chris Haney. He's the Executive Director of the California Budget and Policy Priorities. Chris, take it away.
Great, thank you, Sid. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be with you all virtually, which is how we're all being with each other these days. And I appreciate how many people have signed on to talk about this important set of topics. I'm going to talk about what the federal relief packages have meant for California, but wanted to start by saying just a little bit about what the state is confronting and about the unknowns. If you just look around, you know that there's a significant amount of economic activity that's ground to a halt, and that the decline in that activity has major implications for state and local governments and the nonprofit organizations that partner with them. At the state and local government level, we know that means that revenues are declining. We just don't know to what extent at this point. We know sales tax revenues have to be declining because of reduced consumption and purchases. We know income taxes at the state level have to be declining because of the stock market changes and because people are losing hours and income in their day-to-day workplaces. And so those are going to have implications for state and local government revenues, and we don't have estimates of what that looks like yet. But we know that's happening, and we also know that state and local governments are required to balance their budgets year in, year out, and that's why times like these mean we have to turn to federal fiscal relief as the key buffer against the potential implications for the communities that we're all trying to serve. And the good news is that over the last month, there have now been 3 different stimulus packages or relief packages that have been enacted. The first of those was the Coronavirus Preparedness and Response Supplemental Appropriations Act, which was signed into law on March 6th. That had about $8.3 billion that was primarily devoted to federal, state, and local public health responses and some loans for affected small businesses. Now, we're going to talk about various parts of this in a little bit more detail shortly. The second was the Families First Coronavirus Response Act. People have commonly been just saying the Families First Act, which was signed into law on March 18th and included more than $100 billion for paid sick leave and family leave provisions, nutrition and food assistance, funding to states for unemployment insurance, fiscal relief and expansions for Medicaid, and coverage provisions for COVID testing. And the last piece, though, by far and away the most significant, was the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Security Act, or CARES Act, as you've already heard referred to today, which was signed into law last week on March 27th and provides almost $2 trillion across a whole range of services for workers and households, for small businesses and nonprofit organizations, and for state and local and tribal governments. I'm going to walk through some of the major elements of that here right now. So let me start with that category of the workers and the people who've been affected through lost income, lost hours, et cetera. So the first couple of things that are there have been a series of expansions in unemployment insurance. And the key provisions are that there's been emergency unemployment assistance provided to people who have lost work due to COVID-19 related circumstances. They're providing through the federal government, we're providing an additional $600 weekly on top of state UI of the state unemployment insurance. That will go through July 31st, 2020. California's average unemployment insurance was about $330 a week, so adding $600 a week is significant. The federal unemployment insurance extensions also include an increase in the number of weeks people can tap into those benefits. So if you add that on to what California provides, it now means that workers in California can tap into unemployment insurance for up to 39 weeks at those levels. So a very significant expansion, obviously immediate need due to the number of people we know are losing work. There are some challenges notably excluded from that group, of course, under traditional unemployment insurance, and these changes are that workers without work authorizations, in other words, undocumented workers, aren't covered, and that's a significant portion of the working population in California, something the federal government may be unlikely to address, and the state may need to figure out how to address in its own efforts going forward. Related to the unemployment insurance is increases in paid leave. So there's been an additional 80 hours of paid sick time for people to care for themselves or another individual. I know a lot of you have been figuring out what that means for your own individual organizations, us as well, along with an additional 12 weeks of job-protected family and medical leave if people have to stay home because they're to take care of children due to school or child care closures. And I'm sure you've all been dealing with that with your organizations as well. There's a notable exclusion here. This all has been pretty good news, of course, along the way, but it doesn't include employers in the federal bill that have more than 500 employees, which is 44% of the California workforce. So there's a significant portion of the population not covered. That's something that in federal fiscal relief packages that needs to be addressed. Connected to the unemployment insurance and paid leave, the newest element in the CARES Act is a set of recovery rebates, the checks issue that you've all heard talked a lot about. These will be cash payments of $1,200 per adult or $2,400 for married couples, an additional $500 per dependent child under 17. And to qualify for those, individuals have to have incomes of $75,000 or less, heads of households under $112,500 or less, and married couples under $150,000 or less. And there's no minimum to qualify for the rebates. One of the most common questions we've been hearing is how soon are those dollars going to be available? And you've probably heard a lot of federal talking about the next couple of weeks. The Tax Policy Center at the Urban Institute is actually saying they think at least a month before the Treasury Department will be able to get those rebates out. And those will be going out through direct deposit to people who either filed a return in 2019 or 2018. And then there are some other ways if you didn't file a return that they haven't issued all the details yet, but they're presumably going to be identifying people eligible who didn't have to file returns due to low income, and they'll be providing some benefits in other ways. And some of those details are still being worked out day by day. The last piece I want to mention in the kind of worker and household support side is childcare, where there's additional $3.5 billion in funding through the Child Care and Development Block Grant, or CDBG, to support child care assistance for essential workers, payments to child care providers, and to help with the sanitation of facilities. People are probably wondering how soon those dollars are available, because child care providers are one of those set of organizations really struggling to make ends meet right now. The provisions for when those funds and how those funds will be dispersed are forthcoming soon, hopefully, but that's one of the areas where we still don't know exactly what that's going to look like. It will be through the existing CCDBG structure in some sort of way, because that's how the money flows. There's also a whole set of other supports that are in the food, health, and housing arena. In the food arena, there's both nutritional assistance and food assistance. And nutritional assistance, the earlier fiscal relief packages included $500 million for women, infants, and children, program, $400 million for food banks, $250 million for meals for older adults, people with disabilities, and their caretakers. The next program, the food assistance program, what we used to call food stamps, it's now the SNAP program federally, what we call CalFresh in California, had a series of changes that were in the second act, suspending time limits for single adults under 50 without children, allowing states to provide temporary emergency benefits to households at the maximum level allowed. A lot of people are receiving some level below that, giving the U.S. Department of Agriculture authority to administer, states to give some administrative authority in order to make this easier during an emergency crisis. This is an area that a lot of people feel there wasn't enough done so far, and it's an area where there'll probably be some emphasis in the federal round 4 efforts to the extent those go forward. And of course, there's a lot in the public health arena. There's a whole variety of supports for protecting health and safety across the packages. There was the whole $8.3 billion essentially in the first package was mostly for public health supports. There's another $100 billion in the CARES Act that's largely for hospitals, healthcare providers, testing supplies, and emergency facilities. And then there's a series of provisions that make testing free of charge. There's still a gap about what treatment looks like and how you would help cover the cost of treatment for low-income folks, but a variety of work there. There's some elements in the housing and homelessness arena. There's temporary eviction for renters that are in housing secured by federally backed mortgages or federally backed mortgages, $3.3 billion more for programs like housing voucher programs, $4 billion for cities through emergency grants, and additional energy bill paying support through the LIHEAP program. So there's a little bit overall. It's another area that people feel like there was a real gap because there's a lot of people who are being affected who may be housing unstable, already experiencing homelessness, or at risk of that. So it's another area where it's felt there needs to be more. The other major category where there's a lot of money is in the relief for state, local, and tribal governments. And so the big piece here is $150 billion for a coronavirus relief fund. $15.3 billion of that will flow to California, $9.5 billion to the state, $5.8 billion to local governments with more than 500,000 in population. And then there's a set of funds for tribal governments. And all of these funds have some definition around them that they're supposed to be used for coronavirus-related purposes. What exactly that means is still being discussed, and what kind of flexibility there is for state and local governments. The Treasury Department is supposed to be issuing some news on soon. There's also some help for Medicaid assistance, dollars for education stabilization for K through 12 and higher education, and the Community Development Block Program for housing. So that's largely where all the dollars are in the state piece. Last piece I want to mention, most important probably on all of your minds in terms of your own organizations, is of course the support for small businesses, which in the federal relief package includes nonprofit organizations and various other types of organizations. And so there are these small business administration loans that are now going to be available through June 2020, providing up to $10 million to small businesses, generally those with less than 500 employees. And the process for that is just about to roll out, and I'm sure a lot of people, we're going to talk a little bit more about that on this call. There's also a set of other benefits for folks who already have loans in terms of paying those loans back, some other grants, and there's some tax credits related to small businesses and other nonprofit and other employers who are extending those leave provisions that were mentioned earlier. So I'll kind of leave that at that because we'll be coming back to those kind of elements later in the game. I just lastly want to say, you heard me say along the way a few things about where there are gaps, because seems like there's a lot of money here, and this is a lot of money, and the stimulus acts together constitute a pretty significant effort. But there's going to need to be considerably more given what we know we're facing at the at the state and local government level. It's why you're already hearing conversations about a round 4 fiscal relief package. And that package will probably include some of those elements that I've already discussed. So happy to answer some questions along the way or in the Q&A and chat as needed. Thank you.
Hey, thank you very much, Chris. I just want to say thank you so much for all the questions that are being raised in the chat box and in the Q&A box as well. We're doing our best to try to batch them so that we can call them and try to ask them as groupings as when we get to the Q&A section of this. I'm going to turn it over now to Claire Knowlton. Claire is the Director of Advisory Services for Nonprofit Finance Fund. The floor is yours, Claire. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sid. I'm just going to go ahead and jump right into talking about the SBA because that's like everyone's thing right now, the Paycheck Protection Program. So things around this have moved really, really fast. You know, legislation was approved on the 27th. On the 31st was when we saw the first sort of application and bit of guidance. And applications open on the 3rd, tomorrow. So there's been very limited time to review things, and we understand that some of the guidance has continued to change. I actually have a former client in San Jose who forwarded me an email from her bank that had said like, hey, we're not accepting any SBA loan applications because the government keeps changing the guidance and we're just like suspending that until they finalize their decision making. So I want to put in context, like anything I say today or questions that I answer, it's really worth going and double checking because something could change. So what kind of challenges might nonprofits face in applying for SBA loans? Our assessment is that nonprofits will not need one-on-one technical assistance to apply. A lot of the resources that you're seeing online are fantastic. There seems to be no underwriting to speak of, no financial statements you need to apply, bring in, no cash flow projections. You basically just have to prove that you were in operation before COVID started and that you paid payroll and payroll taxes. So in theory, this should all be like really good. It should be really easy to apply. You just need to go to an SBA approved bank and you can call your bank to find out. You can Google if they're SBA approved. So like in theory, that should all be really simple. In practice, we are actually worried that it will be somewhat difficult for organizations to find a place to actually apply. Some banks are not taking the applications, as I mentioned. Others just kind of the line to apply is really, really long. Thank you for the person who just posted the FMA toolbox in the chat. Oh, I see that just went to the panelists. That was one of the resources I was going to recommend. So if you want to put it in the full chat, moderators, that would be amazing. Great resource for figuring out how to go through your application process. The thing that is really appealing about these loans is that they can be partially or fully forgivable. So with some limitations, it's basically what you spend on payroll, on rent, utilities, and kind of similar things over an 8-week period, starting from the day you get the loan, that can be forgiven with proper documentation. One of the challenges we also see in getting access is we expect there to be a pretty extreme rush on banks in going in for this money. So it's first come, first serve. It is not based on need. I think there are going to be incredible equity issues here about how funds are distributed, which is very problematic. $430 billion in available loans sounds like a lot, but this isn't just available to nonprofits, it's all small businesses. And there are millions of small businesses across the country. So if you just kind of do the math, there's not going to be enough money there. So our advice to nonprofits who are going to go after the SBA loans is, yep, you should probably go after them. Do it really fast. Like apply as soon as possible. Apply tomorrow. Call your bank. Try to get on an appointment list with them. If your bank isn't a good resource or you don't have a banking relationship, you can look at the Community Reinvestment Fund, CRF, and I'll post a link to that in the chat. They seem to have staffed up rather quickly for this. So they had online applications a couple days ago. I looked at Chase's website last night and they still had sort of this like landing page of, we're trying to figure out the guidance. And by the way, we're really busy, don't call us. They had something up as of this morning. So CRF seemed to be like on it earlier than some of the other groups. So, recommending you might look there. So I think I'm just going to stop there and allow for Q&A to come in.
Thanks, Claire. Seiran, I'm going to use moderator's discretion to ask Claire just two questions that seem to be coming up quite a lot. One is for the Paycheck Protection Program. May a nonprofit borrower include payments to independent contractors, consultants, in addition to employees when calculating their average monthly payroll costs to determine the amount of the loan? And then the second one is, can it apply for employees who are 1099s?
Okay, yeah, two very related questions. I'm going to give you my understanding of this answer, but again, we have seen things change very quickly, so I would encourage you to confirm this with your bank. My understanding is no, that the loan is based on payroll, and it's payroll with payroll taxes, right? Which 1099s, independent contractors don't count there. So my understanding is no for the loan amount, which can be up to 2.5 times of your average monthly payroll cost, that is like truly payroll and not independent contractors. But please double check on that because it could change.
Thanks, Claire. And before I turn it over to Seiran, I just want to say thanks to everybody on the chat, because a lot of folks are asking questions and other folks are answering questions. So keep that up as well. And I think that I speak for SDG. Like if we don't get to your questions, because we are down to 21 minutes, we're definitely going to categorize all of these, and we'll get back to you with answers as our follow-up with all of you. So with that, I want to turn it over to Seiran Fu. Seiran is the Vice President of Public Policy and Government Relations at Southern California Grantmakers. Thank you, Seiran, for being here.
Thanks so much, Sid. And recognizing the questions that folks want to go to, I will be brief with my remarks as well. You should be able to see on your screens now a look ahead for what we expect to see in Washington. And to Claire's point about the constantly evolving nature of things, this has a half-life of potentially the length of this webinar. So moving forward with that, we'll look at the House proposal, the Senate's response, and some opportunities for advocacy and preparation in light of what Chris and Claire have just shared with us. And so the House is ready for round 4. They have said that with this round, it's going to be focused on infrastructure, building upon a plan they released in January. We call it Infrastructure X.0 because of the numerous bills that have been introduced around infrastructure during the course of this administration. And so at this point, it's based on the January version, which is focused on the issue areas you see there before. But what's interesting and relevant to this conversation here is that there's an additional $10 billion for community health centers, for education and housing and homelessness. And I think it's really key here that this was announced yesterday on a phone call that Speaker Pelosi made, and the details for these 3 categories are not fully released yet. It's also important for us to put in context that the asks that we've made on a lot of these issues are not meeting the proposals that are coming forth. And I think a good example is around housing and homelessness, where advocates, funders, and national advocates alike asked for $15.5 billion in the Emergency Solutions Grant. And in the Senate stimulus plan, or the relief plan, $4 billion was released. So I think it's important as we think about these opportunities in the House's proposal that this is what we're seeing currently. Like many of you who may have been watching more TV lately, the phrase, "but wait, there's more," I think is really important here as well. Because even though this round 4 is about infrastructure, we've heard conversations now that this would also include additional dollars for state and local governments, to Chris's point about the impact that this is going to have on our budgets. The repeal of the state and local tax deduction has been floated by Speaker Pelosi and Chairman Neal. And infrastructure for national vote by mail has also been talked about as well in this round. And this is in continuation of a previous conversation on the Senate stimulus plan. So what else I think we're looking at a lot of opportunities and possibilities given where we are, but within the context of the moment as well. Other bills to watch for our field that is also really crucial is the Fitzpatrick and Moulton bill that was announced on the same day that CARES was signed. And they took the pieces related to the nonprofit sector advocated by our national partners, independent sector, for example, the Council on Foundations, and introduced it into a billing concept seen here. And the second, in relation to some of the area interests of ours around veterans care, Congressman Mark Takano of Riverside introduced legislation that would protect student veteran benefits in the light of the interruption for around education. And that bill is already in the Senate. Recognizing our community in California and having the largest veterans community, we're putting this here as well for you. And the Senate's response is a wait and see. What we've heard so far is that they want to see what the bill's effect is on the economy. We do know that infrastructure is on their radar, as evidenced by the chair of the Environmental and Public Works Committee introducing that legislation as well. But in terms of when we can see action, I think it's really crucial that we put in context the political and public health and economic context. So first of all, we're seeing that the Speaker and Secretary of the Treasury, Steve Mnuchin, have begun negotiations, and we've heard that these negotiations are accelerating. And when one chamber of the legislature passes a deal that has the administration's approval and moves it over to the next, it puts incredible political pressure. And we saw that happen with the second coronavirus bill when the House acted fairly quickly on that. The second is the reality of the public health and economic context we're in. Within the 30 days to slow the spread that the CDC has released, and of course the state and local orders here in California, it's unclear what the effect will be with regard to these health orders. And on top of the public health modeling of the peak of infection, that too may create pressure for people to act sooner, especially since they're not supposed to come back into session until April 20th. So these two pieces could drive or slow the conversation depending on where we are. And I think the key point for us here as I wrap up my comments is for our opportunity in terms of preparing for advocacy. So all foundations, regardless of private and public and nonprofits, should get bold. Bolder advocacy, the Alliance for Justice provides the rules of the road around advocacy, and particularly the opportunities for us to educate and build relationships with district offices and members of Congress. Since we don't have an explicit ask out in the current fourth round, it's an opportunity to build relationships and make friends before we need them by reaching out to our local offices, collecting and sharing the stories that we're seeing and experiencing ourselves so that our stories are heard and can be connected to a larger national effort. And that's where public foundations such as community foundations and United Ways and nonprofits can be thinking through as well, is what is the infrastructure for your organization to engage in lobbying? Does your board have an explicit approval process in place? Debbie mentioned that our public policy committees across the state for philanthropy, California has been a key feature of how we've been able to move quickly on that. And linking these local efforts with our national partners, such as the United Philanthropy Forum, Independent Sector, Council on Foundations, and the National Council of Nonprofits will be extremely crucial. And this is because we need to speak with United Voice on these issues. And the absence of a United Voice can affect greatly our advocacy efforts. So with that, with my 5 minutes up, I'm turning it back to you, Sid, for Q&A.
Hey, thank you very much, Seiran. We're about 15 minutes left for this webinar. This has been a great discussion just on the chat and even amongst all of our panelists. Claire, I'm going to turn it back over to you in just a second, but Chris, before we go to Claire, I thought I'd ask you to address, if you can, a couple things that are coming up both on this chat, but also just kind of like hearing from others in the community. The first is just around undocumented individuals, and are there resources available to support our undocumented population in California? And then the second is just something that I've been picking up through the chat box and through some of our Q&A questions around faith-based leaders asking about resources for them, considering they're not considered non-essential, and yet they are essential to all of us in many ways. So, Chris, I was hoping you could just do your best to give us some thoughts on those.
Sure, yeah. So my organization's been raising the undocumented individuals and their families a lot in the last couple of weeks, in particular because there's so many mixed status households in California where the children are citizens, or there's one person in the household who's undocumented, but other adults have citizenship or other status. And a lot of the provisions that are being passed actually say that the entire household, for instance, has to have social security numbers in order to access the benefits. And so it ends up prohibiting a larger number of people, even than the number of undocumented folks in the population. And it's a particularly important issue for California. 6% of our workforce are undocumented. They're even larger percentage of the families in the state. And they're excluded from a lot of the employment and unemployment benefits that we're talking about here. They're excluded from the rebates, the checks that are there. The politics of this at the federal government are more difficult even by far than in the state. And so that's why I said earlier, I think this is a place where the state, as it goes into a period where its own budget is going to be constrained, and it's going to have to figure out what kinds of things it can do to fill gaps around the edges of the federal relief, should be thinking about, okay, what can it do to take a significant population in the state and make sure it has access to some other benefits. And there's things like they could create their own funds on unemployment around the federal apparatus that would provide some additional unemployment benefits and the like. There's some things we could do through the state's EITC that would be beneficial to folks who have ITIN numbers for the sake of paying taxes because they're working. So there are some viable solutions available to state leaders. On the faith-based organization side, I mean, I don't know this issue as well as I'd like, but it seems to me that the way that those small business provisions and organizational provisions are written is it says basically organizations under 500 people. So I don't know that there are exact provisions that would sort of say you are prohibited because you're a certain type of organization. But some of those details are also probably likely being sorted out. Maybe there's others here on the call who know more. But it's certainly not in the kind of overarching language that sort of says this is for these kind of organizations and not for these other kinds of organizations that I have seen. But I have to say I haven't, for instance, read all 800 pages of the CARES Act, and some of that's still being sorted through.
Thank you, Chris, very much for that. Claire, I'm going to turn it back over to you because, I think what's wonderful about our community here among nonprofits and foundations is that we have a lot of experts who are even just in our audience who are providing us real-time information and resources as well. So I want to turn it back over to you to kind of have a clarifying comments about some of the things that we are.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Stephanie Keisel. I'm not sure if I'm saying your last name right. Thank you for pointing to some language in the legislation that really could mean like, yes, your independent contractors are captured in what is considered payroll, and that you've offered, like, there's a couple different ways to interpret this. So yeah, maybe not as clear as we need. So please don't take what I said earlier as gospel. If I got that wrong, that, yes, you can include independent contractors in your calculation of payroll. That is 100% possible. Like, everything's moving so quickly right now, and there's a lot of lack of clarity around all of this. So double check like some of the text within the legislation to look into this, see what other opinions look like. I don't feel like I'm in a position to give a particular expert assessment on the definitive answer to this question.
Thanks, Claire. And Debbie, thank you for posting in the chat box information about the webinar that's taking place at 5 p.m. With Mission Finance, Driven Finance, to talk about the application process for the Paycheck Protection Program. I think that's it's going to be key. And Carlos, if you could actually add that link to the chat box, it would be terrific so folks can hopefully join on. I feel like there's so many questions around Paycheck Protection Program that there's just clearly a need for us all to be putting more resources out there about what it is, given it is even, I think the application is open tomorrow. Chris, I do want to go back to you because I think on the undocumented question, it kind of kicked up triggered some new questions around asylum seekers, and I think then it should be kind of noted. Just thinking about refugees, I'm just curious if you could, kind of pull that apart a little bit more.
So it's largely about what status you have federally for the programs that we're talking about. So for like the rebates check, if you have these are questions about whether you don't have a social security number or not. But if you have an ITIN number, a federal identification number for the sake of paying taxes because you're working, that's something where the state could step in. The state can provide benefits to I-10 filers where the federal government doesn't. If you're in other programs, it's about whether you have what kind of work status that you have. So it sort of depends where asylum seekers and refugees fall in relative to sort of what the status is within the various programs. So I'm sorry, that's not sort of a definitive answer, but there's a lot of programs and services here. But the reality is that across most of those, if you don't have legal status in the United States, you're excluded from the benefits. There are some exceptions. There are a couple of the federal programs where they have made exceptions for I-10 filers and the like along the way. But most of the programs you're excluded from.
Thanks, Chris. Another question that seems to be resonating among our chat box is there any way for fiscally sponsored nonprofits to apply for that Paycheck Protection Program or other loans? And Claire, I think that goes to you.
Sorry, yeah, trying to get myself off mute here. My understanding is that the organization has to have payroll and payroll taxes to be able to apply. And so that would probably mean that your parent organization, the group that is fiscally sponsoring you, is the one that would need to go to the bank.
Thank you, I think, for that clarity. I'm also, getting some questions I see in the chat box around small minority businesses who bank with minority banks. And most of them are even less prepared in many ways than mainstream institutions. Chris, Seyran, Claire, I really feel like this should be open to all of us. Like, do you know if there are resources out there, or is it really just kind of going to our go-to places to give them the resources that they need?
What we've been recommending is any bank that you have a relationship with, check with them if they are SBA approved. And it's very possible that many minority-owned banks are SBA approved and have done SBA loans in the past. So if that is the case, then there may be great access there. What we anticipate is that banks are likely going to prioritize processing loans for those organizations or businesses that they have lent to before, that have had small business administration loans with them in the past, and that's not most nonprofits. I think under this question is a really huge problematic reality that there's a major equity issue here, and I think with the disbursement of these funds, we can just see an exacerbation and repetition of government dollars going to white people, not going to communities of color. It's first come, first serve. And so getting in line is the best option. The other thing I just want to add is that while we are saying like get in line, apply for these loans, also we are recommending that you don't plan around actually receiving the dollars because we don't know how quickly they will go. So continue making decisions as if the money won't come in. And if it does, things should be hopefully good.
Thanks, Claire. Debbie, do you want to add to this?
Thank you. Thanks, Sid. One thing I would mention is when I talked at the top of the hour about how funders could leverage their political and social capital in support of the nonprofit sector at this time. I think this is a perfect example of foundations who have business relationships with their banks, really weighing in with those banks to say now is the time to be proactive, to accept as many applications from new customers as you possibly can. San Diego grant makers, in our webinar tonight at 5, we will publish a list of all of the SBA lenders in the counties we serve. But at the same point in time, we're leveraging the might of our 150 members with all of our banking institutions to say, hey, we need you to step in with us to the extent that you can. We know you don't know everything now, but we just need to know that you're going to help, because this is a whole new system for most nonprofit organizations. They're not accustomed to engaging in the SBA system, and so we just need to help pave the way for those resources to get to our sector.
Thank you, Debbie. We only have a couple minutes remaining. I'm going to turn it back over to you for some final thoughts and maybe another breath kind of like exercise, since this was a whirlwind of information, and I think a lot of us really appreciated the way you kicked us off. But before I do that, Seyran, I just wanted to ask you, like, just on this question around advocacy, what more, can we do, and what would you recommend our nonprofits that are in the field that are trying to deal with these individual things right now, but to really help us think about the horizon? And I'd love to hear just like a couple thoughts from you around advocacy strategies.
Absolutely. So there's the internal component piece to the advocacy question, is in terms of the capacity of the organization to do that. Do you have the policy and procedures in place, the ability with the board to be able to take that opportunity and be able to build that capacity internally? So I think that's addressing that portion of the question there. I think secondly, on the external side, the relationships that we're building, that to Debbie's point about access and opportunity with foundations and banks, is the role of philanthropy to be the convener and to use the civic engagement opportunities that we've had and built over this time as in our role of civil society to be able to facilitate those relationships as well. And I think we saw that, and we've seen that with different collaborations along different issue areas, whether it's Funders Together to End Homelessness, which has brought nonprofits, funders, and government together in those specific scenarios, to a broader, larger conversation about how these three sectors can work together in these extraordinary times. So I think that those are multiple components there, both the internal and the external. And then one final piece, and because I do think we should always end with some glimmer of opportunity and hope, is that one thing that we did hear, at least from the Secretary of Treasury, is that he would go back to Congress and ask for more money for the SBA loans in the 7-8 category. That's not to say we'll get it. I want to make that very clear. And to Claire's point, is it's hard to plan around everything that's moving in flux. But I think that too is a moment for us as we think about different roles we play in civil society, how we make sure when that ask is made, we have a very clear path for nonprofits and foundations moving forward that isn't in competition with other sectors, that is really dedicated for us. And that's, I think, an important advocacy opportunity there too.
Thank you, Seyran, for kind of closing our conversation on that note. And with that, thank you everybody for participating, and thank you to all the panelists for taking all of your time. Debbie, I'm going to turn it back over to you for some final thoughts.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So thank you, Sid and Claire and Chris and Seyran, really for sharing your insights and for sharing what we know today. As I said, it's uncertain times, and as I think you heard from the panelists, we are all working together to figure this out. I want to thank the Philanthropy California team who designed and produced today's program. It's 60 staff strong who normally are working together in 3 offices, who now have 60 individual home offices from which they put everything together. So we know all of the rest of you know how to wrestle with that right now. But I think I just want to close with the fact that we're all in the nonprofit sector together, whether the role of funding into the sector to support the work, or whether we're the on-the-ground service provider directly supporting our communities. So we're all in this together, and we're all seeking ways that we can actually maximize our efforts, because we know our communities need us at this time. So just know that, we're constantly looking for solutions. We hope each of you will reach out to each other. As Sid referenced, this was a very lively chat where we were learning from each other. I don't think there is anyone expert at this time, so we just want to grow a whole field of experts as we navigate our way together. When the recording comes out, there will be a short survey. I hope you'll take a few minutes to fill that out because it really helps us be able to provide the best programming that meets your needs. And with that, I wish you the best for continued health and wellness, and be strong. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.